You're listening to Greater Good Radio Hawaii, where we develop tomorrow's leaders by bringing you up close and personal with today's top business people. Today's guest is Nicholas MITSAKOS, the chairman of the board of directors for Nayna International. Nicholas co-founded 9 companies that achieved successful IPOs or acquisitions and has had a unique view on social entrepreneurship.
Right, so one of the things that I've talked to others about is, we grew up in a unique time. And I'll say, I was born in 1959. And so when I was a very small child, we had a president who said, we're going to go to the moon. And I grew up with the moonshot as something that was on the news almost every night. Here's what the Mercury program's doing. Here's what the Apollo program's doing. Here's how far they got. And then they landed on the moon. And I never forgot that moment, as I think anyone who watched it would never forget. But something we all sort of felt was, we can do anything. We could do that. Imagine what we could do if we just put our mind to it. And I think that's a unique experience for us. And so if you look at these well-known characters like, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, the list goes on and on, they all grew up at that moment as well. And I think that changed us. I think that, we look and say, well, we can do it. And if we have a failure, if we have the equivalent of Apollo 1 and a true disaster, we can recover. And, for us, failing is sort of a learning experience that can bring you to success later. And I think that the stigma of failure was sort of ameliorated in our lifetimes, at least in America. It's different overseas. Mm-hmm. But I think our parents grew up with a different kind of sense. Like if you started a business and it didn't succeed, you really had a problem to deal with the rest of your professional career. You're a failure. You wasted people's money. You did these things. We don't feel that stigma because we're all willing to take that risk because we all know that if this doesn't succeed, we still have the chance to do something else that can succeed. And I think that's a fundamental difference.
So let's go back then. I mean, how did you get started in all of this? You were an entrepreneur from the get-go, or you started working somewhere and then you moved on? How did this come about?
Yeah, I sort of refer to myself as the accidental entrepreneur. And the seriousness of it was I was in college. I had a high school buddy, and he and I learned how to program when we were in high school. Now this is the early 70s, so I sort of say I wrote my first program in 1973, so I think that makes me one of the grandfathers.
Was that on punch cards, or what is that?
It was punch cards.
Okay.
You fill in with a little pencil and hope they don't get out of order, otherwise you're a dead man. Right? The good old days. And so when we were in college, we wrote some programs just for fun, which maybe makes me a geek, but we wrote some programs for fun. And then it was he actually who had the idea, well, maybe we can sell this to somebody. And we started a mail order business, buy our program. And people did, which just amazed me. And
where did you advertise that? How did people find out about this?
There was an emerging graphics industry, which was probably focused around video games more than anywhere else. And this is back in the day when if you wanted to program a straight line that sort of curved across a screen, that took you a week in the programming language C. But if somebody else did it for you, you'd pay money for that. And so today they're called graphics engines, which just really means, subroutines, and you can point and click and stuff happens. Well, that stuff is someone had to program that at some point, and that's kind of what we did.
Almost like they outsourced it to you back in the day.
Back in the day. That's exactly what it was. We just figured, well, we know you need this program, and so do 50 other people if you want to save yourself a week's worth of time, so we'll write it and sell it to you.
And then were you guys making a lot of money in college?
I was making about 5 times the amount of money as my job offer when I graduated, so I thought sticking with this was a better option.
And you graduated from, where was your undergrad?
Well, undergrad was University of Southern California.
Oh, okay.
And so I had degrees in biology and degrees in computer science. And I was going to be a doctor, and I think my mother still might regret that to this day. And instead of going to medical school, I started a company. And I had also gotten into business school, and later on, several years later.
So why did you end up going to Harvard Business School if you already were running these successful businesses?
Oh, the short answer is it's hard to turn down a place like Harvard Business School. But the longer answer is we sold that company, and we sold it after almost 3 years. And that was a success. And in trying to figure out what to do next, I thought the opportunity to go to a place like Harvard and find out kind of how the business world worked versus finding it out on an ad hoc basis. And I can back up a little bit here because I've been an MBA student and I've been an MBA teacher.
Okay.
And I think that for certain people, an MBA makes a lot of sense. For a lot of people, it doesn't. And so if you're looking for perspective about the business world, if you're looking for an understanding of experiences that you couldn't otherwise have, or if you're looking for access to a profession that you really kind of can't otherwise get unless you have an MBA, it makes a lot of sense. If you want to go to just learn general business, I back up from that and say, well, gee, you have a job. What aren't you learning? And I think if you go about education, I think with the right approach, which is, what do I really want out of this? And I think it makes you a better student. It makes you more focused, and it keeps perhaps some people from, I'll call it wasting their time. But is education ever a waste of time? I can't argue that it is. But there may be some interesting applications.
Maybe opportunity costs where you could be doing something else that would be more beneficial. Maybe
there is. And I have several friends in Silicon Valley who use the same concept, which is if they have a successful company, they will take a couple of years off and get a degree in something, just to give them perspective, and then come back and start another company.
They've also got time at that point, right?
They've
already
time.
made it.
You've got some flexibility, and I guess I'm advocating that you don't need to jump into the next thing. And what helps is just a perspective about the world and as it evolves, because it's changing so much that unless you step out and really take a look and see what's happening, you're going to miss out on many, many things. And so I think about my experiences in Asia and in China. I love to say this statistic. So in 1983, I made my first trip to Beijing. There were 200 cars in the entire city. Okay, millions of bicycles and 200 cars. So 20 years later, there are 2 million cars in Beijing. And so that's a change that's just unprecedented. And unless you see that firsthand, you can't believe it. You can't see what the impact of something like that is. And now, of course, it's all over the media, the China factor and the China this and the China that, blah, blah, blah. There's substance and then there's hype. And if you look at my other example might be kind of the internet development. So certainly in the late 90s, there was substance and there was a lot of hype. But as that cleared away, you see that there really was substance. I mean, there are internet-based companies that are quite profitable, quite successful, and there'll be many more. And understanding what really was reality versus what was just someone's impression of what was happening, the only way you can gain that is firsthand experience. And so I think, again, something like, I use China as an example, you can see there is great opportunity. There's also great risk. And there are lots of issues that you won't uncover unless you're there and you can be on the ground talking to people and experiencing things.
When you first sold that initial company that you guys started, how did that come about? Did you approach people or somebody approached you with an offer?
I think to answer that question, I'll give a general observation that anyone out there who owns a company, you should know this one simple truth. Companies are never sold, they're bought. So if you try to sell something, chances are you won't succeed, or you certainly won't get a price that's other than what you could have gotten, unless you assume that you're going to be an independent, sustainable entity. If you ever start a business with any other perspective other than I'm on my own, I'm independent, I'm here forever, you'll compromise yourself. And so now to answer your question, we were approached. And we were approached by Atari, a video game company that said, we want to own all that. And more importantly, we don't want anyone else to own that. So with your tools, we can write video games.
Did you have patents at the time on your technology?
We did. And luckily...
So you guys were sophisticated straight off the bat.
You get sophisticated by asking a lot of questions of a lot of people. And I guess if there's another general observation I'll make is that regardless of how smart you are, there's a great line that someone actually told me, and I'll pass it on to you. And it was our lawyer when we started this. And by the way, our lawyer was one of our employees' fathers, okay? So you get lucky sometimes too. But he said, look, if you're going to start a company, there's probably 50 things you need to know. If you're a genius, you probably can think of 25 of them. Chances are you're not a genius. So a lot of things are going to happen that you would not have thought of that you have to deal with. So what are you going to do about that? Just try to figure it out on your own? No, the answer is you find the other 20 people who know one or two things, and you learn. And so we asked a lot of questions like, well, how do you do that? How do you protect yourself? We just wrote a program. We're not naive to think that it takes you back then, probably 10 minutes to copy a software. Today it takes you less than a second. And so all of a sudden we've lost all of our value. How do you protect that? All of those kind of, common sense is always...
How old were you guys when you were doing this?
I was 21 when the company was founded. I was the CEO at 21 years old. And an experienced entrepreneur at 24, right?
So you're still taking classes while you're running your company?
When we launched the company, I was still in school. I was a senior in college.
So you're running the company out of a dorm room?
Out of a dorm room, yes.
Oh, like Michael Dell, kind of.
Yes. Well, Michael's done a little bit better than I over the years. But and it would maybe that other sense that we realized that, well, you don't need a lot of physical structure,
right,
to create. And that's the other thing, I guess, that our era, as it were, has created for us. That you can be a virtual company, you can create things, you don't need infrastructure. I mean, it's interesting. I remember anecdotally talking with, I have an older brother and older cousins, and I'm going to start a company, and they're like, well, where? You have to hire a secretary, you have to get a parking spot, you have to get an office. It's like, no, you kind of get a phone line and a computer, and you're sort of in business, and a mailing address. And that was something that was very new, even among, we'll call it my contemporaries, but if you were 5 years older, 10 years older, you had no idea that you could actually do that. And there is an advantage, by the way. I'll call it the advantage of naivete. Like, you don't know you're not supposed to be able to do it, right? And you think about, maybe the analogy is, a child who sort of speaks his mind with great clarity because he doesn't know he's supposed to be politically correct. And so the truths come out. And this happens, I think, to a lot of people. If you don't know you're not supposed to do it, you don't think about those limitations. And my more general point is, more often than not, the limitations I confront from my entrepreneurial partners and others are ones of their own creation. Like, well, we're not supposed to be able to do that, and so therefore you don't. And to flip it on itself, a friend of mine who's a very successful venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, I came to him with an idea, and I said, this technology doesn't exist, and we've got the breakthrough. This is going to be great. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, but once you make the breakthrough, everyone else will realize it can be done. So your breakthrough isn't sustainable. That's not a company. That's an interesting development. And as we all know, the first mover rarely survives for this very reason, that people realize, yeah, I guess you can do that. And so that's another important concept, that it's not the breakthrough, the innovation that makes the distinction. It's, what will you do with it? How do you manage that? How do you create a real business from it?
You're listening to Greater Good Radio Hawaii, where we've developed tomorrow's leaders by bringing you up close and personal with today's top business people.